USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Great solos don't make a symphony. In music or AI, get AI that's in tune with your business at IBM.com. The AI built for business. IBM.
At the Hyundai Getaway Sales Event, get deals so right, it almost feels wrong. Now's the best time to get that Hyundai you've always wanted. Plus, every new Hyundai comes with America's best warranty and 3 years or 36,000 miles of limited complimentary maintenance. Don't think you can get away with all that? Think again. The Hyundai Getaway Sales Event. Visit your local Hyundai dealer today. It's a great day for a new Hyundai.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into
The wrong station. Bald, egghead, cue ball, chrome dome, shiner. These are the words he heard in his head as he went about his day, going to and from the office, out getting groceries, or at the park with his kids. These words, spoken with a hushed, vicious glee, and accompanied by stifled, gibbering laughter, spoken by strangers and friends alike, spoken even by his wife. He never actually heard them say it, but he knew they were. He was sure of it. They weren't, of course, because, in reality, very few people noticed, and not a one of them cared. He wasn't even bald. Balding, to be sure, but a long way off from the hairless end of that journey. Certainly his wife cared least of all. He was a good man, a good partner and father. To her, he was kinder, wiser, funnier, and more attractive now than he'd ever been. And though he had his flaws, like every person does, she loved him more with every passing day and year. A receding hairline simply didn't factor into it. Why, then, did this anxiety gnaw at him? Perhaps because his hair had been so coarse and thick in his younger days, so thin and wind-blown it seemed to him now, that it was this juxtaposition. Or maybe because the change had come on so suddenly, though not quite so suddenly as he imagined it, and it was the shock of when he finally noticed the change in the mirror one morning. And perhaps it was because, even though he always tried to think critically about the world around him, and not hold rigid views on what it meant to be a man in that day and age, the loss of his hair maybe felt like the loss of something else deep down. Days gone by that were less stressful, more fun, more free. So, despite it being a non-issue, despite nobody else caring, he cared. Quite a lot. What to do then? His first thought was to look into gene replacement therapy, but quite early into investigating that option, his stomach dropped. The procedures had been perfected decades earlier, but were still prohibitively expensive, especially for cosmetic applications. If you had the cash to burn, you could be 6'10" and make your eyes the color of pomegranate. But Lord forbid someone on a hardware technician's salary tried to stave off vertex hair loss. Then there were, of course, the classics, plugs or a transplant. But despite the impression that new century advances in genetics might have given you, Those particular dark arts had not kept up quite as well. Results were often spotty, and being the relics they were, the practice was rife with quackery. He didn't love the idea of some mad doctor poking his head full of holes and stuffing them with whatever off-world supply of hair could be had cheapest. For all he knew, some species from an Arctic world with an oily double coat. Try explaining that to the wife and kids. He was beginning to give up hope. He was considering becoming a hat guy. That's when he saw the ad. Instant hair growth, all natural, if you really want it. It was that last bit that caught his attention. He'd seen plenty of advertisements making outrageous claims about a product's efficacy, or spouting off long lists of natural ingredients, most of it all bullshit. But there was something about that last part, the implied challenge it carried. Of course he wanted it. Anyone in his position wanted it. It was stating the obvious. And yet, in the microsecond in which he first saw and processed those words, some part of him decided that he'd have to be a real sucker not to at least check this option out. That if he didn't, well, then maybe he didn't really want it. A tap and a swipe on the holo display, and he was on their site. Decent design, good amount of testimonials. It didn't seem like a scam, or at least not an obvious one. Pretty cliched mission statement. Lines like, "We're here to help men. Your hair is your confidence. Reclaim it if you can." Again, a bit odd, but morbid curiosity was now giving way to genuine intrigue. He tapped onto the contact information. Consultation in person only. A second-story office, not quite near the downtown core, but not in Midtown either. Not quite the financial district, but not the slums. Think of those few remaining pockets of industrial neighborhood where you might live. The front entrance was a dirty glass door, a small, once white, scuff-stained foyer, a dimly lit stairwell. But the office itself was sleek, clean, with espresso-brown painted walls and tastefully matching decor. There was a dance going on here, signals telling him that this was a bad idea and that he should turn around, with just enough expense having been paid to convince him that this might be legitimate, that he should at least give it a look and see. A young, quite attractive woman at the reception desk asked him to fill out some basic information, to wait out here, and that Mr. Fuller would be ready for him shortly. As he turned to find a seat, she reached out and grabbed his forearm, and congratulated him for being there, her face a rehearsed mural of commiseration, friendliness, flirtation. Taking a seat, he looked around. Framed photographs were hung here and there. Men on horseback, working on motorcycles, playing tennis, movie stars, military officers, other rough-and-tumble types, each sporting a full head of healthy hair. "Hope I haven't kept you long." He turned his head. A man was standing at the door beside the desk, a trim, handsome man in his late 30s or early 40s, square-jawed with dark stubble and pearly teeth. He was dressed in a very classic style, blue suit, crisp white button-down shirt, shining black patent leather Oxfords. And his hair was glorious, a pristinely coiffed side part of chestnut brown, thick and wavy. Despite himself, he felt deeply jealous in that moment. He almost drooled. The man, Mr. Fuller, presumably, gestured him in, and as they passed the threshold, the receptionist turned and delivered a final, saccharine, "Good luck." "Wow, she likes you," said Fuller as they walked down the hallway. "Watch out, my friend. When we're done with you, you'll have to peel her off." He gave an awkward chuckle and waved off the idea, flashing his wedding ring. "I'm spoken for." "Ah," said Fuller, giving a piteous, rueful smile. "To each their own." The office was dark. No windows. A simple desk, a lamp in the corner, and a large view screen on one wall. "So," started Fuller, gliding into his desk chair, leaning back, fingers steepled. You've lost something. Do you know what exactly? My hair? Fuller chuckled sadly to himself. Well, yes, your hair. But that's not what I'm talking about. He leaned in. You've lost your mojo, my friend. Your joie de vivre. Am I wrong? He didn't quite know what to say to that. I can see it on your face. Sulking expression. People probably look at you like you're a loser, thinking, this guy doesn't fuck. And I know because I was like you a few years ago. But then I took it back. And now look at all this. A thriving business, bombshell secretary. All because I took my balls back. He'd heard enough. He hadn't come here to suffer abuse, to suffer this macho screed. And not that he'd admit it. It hurt deeply to actually hear from someone else what he'd been telling himself in those dark, quiet moments alone. He turned for the door. But as he reached for the handle, he heard the small thud of glass on wood behind him. Turning again, he saw that Fuller had produced a small, dark bottle with a dropper head. Don't you want to know what I'm selling? He stared at that smug face, that fucking gorgeous hair, and all it implied. He let go of the handle. I thought so. Put out your hand. He approached slowly. He didn't like Fuller. This was an undeniably untrustworthy man. But still, something about the tactics he was using kept him just barely hooked in. Let's see where this goes. What's the worst that could happen? Fuller unscrewed the top of the bottle, gently pressed the squeezy end, and dropped a single bead down onto the man's open palm. It was a rosy pink, translucent. It hit his skin with a tiny splash, and he rubbed at it with his thumb on the same hand. Oily, but not greasy. It absorbed easily into his skin. Then, quite quickly, he felt it. A heat under the surface of his palm, muscles twisting, cramping, nerves stinging, skin prickling. A dark speck, here, there, all over, specks now erupting and shooting out as coarse fibers. It felt like the insides of his hand were being turned outside, as a thick rug of hair grew out of the full width of his palm to a length of nearly 2 inches, before slowly coming to a stop. He stood there dumbfounded, staring at his hand and petting it like a cat. There's a planet we discovered a couple years back, on the rim. He turned back to Fuller, who himself had turned toward the view screen, where he was pulling up system charts. He zoomed in on one emerald sphere, mostly tropical surface conditions, extremely dense with foliage and fauna. Farfield teams have visited the surface, made initial assessments, collected samples. That's it so far. Eventually, there will be large-scale resource extraction, and maybe part of the surface will be preserved and converted into a resort world. But there's just not enough manpower right now. Too many higher priority sites of interest in the system. So for the moment, it's open season for anyone with a ship. He screwed the dropper back onto the bottle, as the view screen now displayed chemical structures and analytical data. I purchased access to this initial data. Call it an investment. And one thing really caught my eye. They found it pooled on the forest floor, slathered on rocks and mixed in with shit. An excretion from one of the local fauna, which, as you can see, when applied to the skin, has very interesting, very potent side effects. Fuller gave him a toothy smile, self-satisfied, a cat with a bowl of milk. He knew this was where the pin dropped. He gulped, bracing himself for the worst and then some. He asked Fuller, "How much?" But to his surprise, Fuller half turned away and put the bottle back into a drawer in his desk. "Oh, this? Not for sale. It's a synthetic recreation. For demonstration only." The man raised an eyebrow. Surely he didn't mean, "If I sold this to you, That would just be me giving you your manhood back. Like I've been saying this whole time. You need to take it back. What? He scoffed. From you? No. Fuller laughed. The screen switched back to a view of that lush jungle world. Grainy footage of something large lumbering through the trees. From it. It was insane what he was agreeing to. He would have a few months' time to get into condition and learn some necessary skills, and then he would be escorted by a crack team of specialists into the dense jungles of this unexplored planet, where they would track down this creature and retrieve its excretions. The price was high, but not so high as he would have thought. Not only that, but there wasn't even a deposit. We get paid when you get hair. That's a guarantee. He was getting up at 4:30 every day to run. He was learning how to rappel. He hated this. Probably looked like he was having an affair. But there were changes he was noticing that he didn't hate. Fuller had recommended multiple resources to help with his training and dieting. Every day he was feeling stronger and just a bit more confident about this expedition. Though, like there had been with Fuller's office, there was a dance going on here as well. He'd start watching someone's holovids for advice on his squat form or on high-protein recipes. Then eventually he'd get deep enough that he'd find that person held opinions on weight loss or performance enhancement he didn't quite like the timbre of. He'd be following an ex-colonial Marine who taught people how to identify poisonous plants on rim worlds, then get a taste of their thoughts on Terran politics. Each time, he'd stop watching and move on to another person the algorithm served him, hoping they'd be more palatable. Each time, a little more accepting that that was simply the space he was orbiting within. Less observed were the early evening crashes in energy after workouts, his absorption into this other world that drew his attention away from his family, their day-to-day, their needs, their unconditional love. But these consequences, observed or not, felt worth it. When he'd watched these other men, many like Fuller, with their curated lives that he compared to his own idealized past, each, like Fuller, with beautiful hair unravaged by time. Hair that could be his. Oh yes, weeks after that first meeting he was still shaving his palm every morning, with dark stubble having appeared on it by midday. So maybe, after a bit of discomfort and a bit of pain, it would all be worth it, because he would have his hair back, which meant he had... What did it mean exactly? His mojo? No, that was absurd. It wasn't that deep. He told himself he wasn't really buying into what Fuller was saying, that this was just the most straightforward path to getting a full head of hair. If you can believe that. God, his palm itched. A 20-hour shuttle ride, and they were nearly there. Thank God, because it had been on an old discontinued J780, and the ride had not been smooth. He'd already been queasy before they even took off. He told his wife it was a week-long work retreat. She didn't seem to believe the lie, but she did accept it, and that made him feel sick. She'd find out sooner or later, presumably when he came home, so he wasn't sure why he lied about it at all. Probably because deep down he was embarrassed about the whole thing. Because she wouldn't understand. She'd say it was dangerous, that it didn't matter, the way she always did when he spent those long moments in front of the mirror, tilting his head forward and grimacing at the view. But of course she'd say that. 5 other men in the shuttle with him. Despite the long, cramped ride, he knew little about his companions. No small talk, he'd been told. These were professionals and they weren't to be distracted. It was also for his privacy, Fuller had insisted. He scratched at his head and excused himself to the restroom. Looking at himself in the mirror, it felt surreal, kitted out in a full environmental hardsuit mesh hybrid. He ripped off the mouthpiece and cowl to splash his face with cold water, and looked back up. Bald. Truly, now. Shaved it all off this morning, per Fuller's instructions, as a sort of ritual of scapular rebirth, he'd been told. And when he'd seemed hesitant about that notion, so that the tonic would take as well as possible at the end of all this. He scratched at his head again. No going back now. It was hot, sticky, humid as all hell. What you'd expect, he supposed. They'd been out there for nearly 8 hours and had only just recently caught the trail. Now they were out of the shade of the deep bush and hiking up a vine-covered hill, the sun beaming down. He could feel the meniscus of sweat forming between his scalp and the suit. According to the data, the day-night cycle here was just shy of 53 hours. He hoped this wouldn't take that long. But if it did, the night cool would be a welcome reprieve. These specialists with him didn't seem all that competent, or at least no more competent than he was out here. There'd been a good deal of mincing and arguing over the topography once they'd left the drop site. After only a few hours, several of their party were winded and the group had to take a prolonged breather. He himself had to yank one of the team members back and stop him from wandering right into a cluster of toxic ferns. Real amateur hour stuff. Yet another way Fuller was cutting corners, he imagined. He didn't see any other way this business model could turn a profit. But in spite of general incompetence, they'd stumbled onto signs of the creature. Deep tracks in the mud of the jungle floor. And huge, 4 hands length and 3 width. Tracks that hinted at a creature with 2 powerful curved digits and an opposable thumb that had dragged across the topsoil. Titanic fumets here and there, every half-mile or so along the path it had created in its wake. On inspection, these contained a good amount of fruit seeds and plant husk, and a not insignificant amount of small bones, or shards of larger, broken ones. And, of course, pooled in trace amounts around the footprints, broken trees, and scat. That oily pink residue. It was creeping up on him now, the reality that they not only had to find this thing, but bring it down, too. Well, the word kill had never been used, but it didn't have to be. They weren't out here with nets and trawl lines. Had some holovids and a few months on the treadmill really prepared him for this? He hefted the well-used Z-gun at his hip, looking at the men around him, back over his shoulder in the direction of that Junker shuttle. He hoped that it at least worked as described. That's when he heard a yelp from the man next to him. They tripped over something, or simply stepped into it without looking. Either way, their right foot was now caught in a tangle of vines, which would in itself have been worthy of a yelp. But rooted by those vines was a large flower, already large with its petals neatly folded in sleep, which now turned toward the snarled man and opened them wide, to a height of nearly 2 meters. Something noxious was burbling deep within its pistil. The stamen lashed out like huge serpents' tongues, and sensing something near it, the flower throbbed and let out a cloud of gas mingled with pollen, spraying the man who tripped, and him too. It stank. It stung in his eyes. It shouldn't have, with the mask and respirator he was wearing, but evidently those too were cheap pieces of shit. He took a few steps back, waving the cloud away and ripping off mask and cowl all at once. Coughing, rubbing at his eyes, he tried to catch his breath, and found that he could, quite easily. All the information he'd been given had indicated the atmosphere was barely breathable for humans, but each inhalation he took was rich with oxygen. While trying to piece this contradiction together, he looked up through tears to see that the other man had also gotten away from the cloud, had also taken off his cowl, was also sporting a freshly shaven head. The 2 men looked at each other. A grim realization dawned on him, but it dawned on the other man a second sooner. Before he could say anything, do anything, the man rushed him and pushed him. He fell backward, unable to keep his balance with his heavy pack on the incline. He was rolling down, unable to stop himself. Panic set in, and then there was a thud and a crack, a sharp pain at the base of his skull. And then darkness. Hard bristles brushed across his face, and he awoke in a rush of adrenaline, ready to fight off some predator or swat an enormous bug off his face. But there was no such enemy abound. Groaning in terrible discomfort and squinting in the sun as he lay on his back, he realized that what he'd felt was his own hair-covered hand resting on his cheek. The glove must have torn in the fall. That's right. He'd fallen. He'd been pushed. He groaned to his feet and started trudging back up that hill. His head was bleeding. He could feel the warm drip running down the back of his neck. But he'd have to deal with that later. It made sense now, this arrangement. These weren't crack specialists out here with him. They were other clients. Men like him who needed the tonic. No wonder he hadn't had to pay a deposit. It wasn't about money. They were here as volunteer labor. But why the sudden attack? On that, he wasn't as certain. Surely, if they found the creature, there would be enough of that secretion for all of them. But maybe it wasn't about that. For the same reason he hadn't told his wife about this excursion, maybe these other men were desperate to keep it a secret. Or maybe the rest of them had bought more into the rhetoric. Taking back your hair didn't involve working with others toward a common goal. Step by painful step, something wasn't quite right with one of his knees either. He hiked back up that hill. At least he could leave his cracked Zed and other broken equipment behind. Whatever the case was with the others, his only ticket to safety, to making sure he wasn't left stranded on this planet, was finding that animal, the pink, oily gold within. He hoped. Before that, though, he found carnage. First, at the outcropping where he'd been pushed down. 2 men lay splayed out on the ground, one with a hole in his guts and another with most of his shoulder missing, both wounds sizzling with the signs of hard light. One of them was the man who'd shoved him. His feet were still tangled, and his face was exposed and staring up at the sky with dead eyes. What had he been back in the world? He had one of those everyday faces you might see on a teller or transit operator. Did he have a family? It was a sick waste of life. What had made this man so desperate that he'd abandon everything? Why'd he bundled up so much importance in this? In his manhood? In his hair? Though, who was he to ask those questions? He was here too, wasn't he? Clearly it had been important to him. That would have to be something for reflection when he made it back home. For now, he moved on. About a click further on, he found more of the team. Maybe they'd scattered after that firefight down the hill, but they were all headed in the same direction. It seemed like they'd found what they were looking for. One had had his leg torn clean off his body. No Z-burn wound here. You could see where the tendons had been pulled to the point of snapping, where part of the pelvis had cracked and come away. Another was just legs and the bottom half of his torso, which ended in a smooth inside curve, as if something had picked him up and bisected him in one clean bite. The blood trail continued on from here, and he followed, much more careful now to use the trees for cover, trying desperately to slow his breathing and heart rate. Eventually, that incline plateaued, and the forest grew thick again, in a sort of hilltop grove. Maybe this was its territory where it nested. The jungle sounds of chirping bird-like things and smaller hooting animals were more quiet here. The blood became scant, but the tonic was thick here. And soon he spied a clearing ahead of him. Very slowly, softly as he could, he crept up to the edge and looked within. Bald. Huge. And bald. It was snoring loudly, laying on its side. The last team member's corpse lay lifeless beside it. A snack for later. Huge and pink and completely hairless. A thick, muscular body, like an elephant, but with those curved digits and an almost ape-like, almost seal-like head. And much like with those large terrestrial animals back on Earth, seeing it before him with his own eyes, he couldn't help but take in the majesty of this creature, the strength, the absolute assuredness, not in an arrogant way, but simply as it was. This creature didn't care that it was bald. It didn't know what bald was. He could see, looking closer at its exposed underbelly, a huge sack hanging off of it, translucent skin taut with fluid, pearls of pink oil perspiring off of it. A liquid it clearly produced for some means of internal regulation he didn't presume to understand. Not some miracle hair-giving tonic, but just something it needed. It didn't need hair, apparently, this marvel of nature. And taking it in, he wondered if he didn't really need it either. That's when he heard the electric whine of a Z-gun charging up over his shoulder. A pulse rang out, deafening, and the creature opened shining, black, animal eyes just in time to see a glint of golden light before its big, majestic head exploded, spraying bits of bone and pink meat all over the clearing. The man looked on dismayed, bare hand and furred hand held over his ringing ears. Something beside him stepped out into the clearing, some refraction of light. A moment later, he heard a click, and the sheen of a personal reflex shield died down. Standing there, steaming weapon in hand, shit-eating grin plastered across his face, was Fuller. That's the part he hadn't clued together yet. What was in all this for him? "Finally," Fuller said, saliva flecking off his lips. "I've sent dozens of you losers out here, and finally I found it." He approached Fuller, who turned around and gave him a swift kick to his bad knee, sending him to the ground in agony. Then, looking down, Fuller raised his hand to his head, to that pristine mane of chestnut hair, and in one swift motion, ripped it off. A very expensive, very convincing toupee that he threw down into the mud. "Don't get any ideas. This is mine. It's all mine." He unsheathed a vicious-looking knife and grabbed a clear plastic container at his side. "You can have that synthetic shit," he said over his shoulder, tromping toward the creature's body. "I'm taking the real thing, because that's what I do, because I'm not a pussy." Laying there in the muck, staring on, he felt a heavy dread and the full weight of his folly. He'd truly been taken in by not only a fraud, but one too cowardly to risk his own life planetside. It would be a hard-learned lesson, if Fuller let him leave this place alive. He plunged the knife deeply into the tonic sack and carved down, pulled the knife with the full weight of his body, then began to collect the oozing fluid in the container. Yes! Yes! It wasn't a clean cut. Spurts of liquid sprayed sporadically. They hit Fuller's scalp and cheek, and small patches of dark hair appeared. Fuller cackled. "Yeah, give me more of that!" He grabbed the knife handle and started zigzagging it across the creature's skin and flesh, making an absolute wreckage of that external organ. Small sprays turned into a steady stream. There was a gurgle and a rumble from within, and then a geyser of pink fluid mingled with hot blood surged forth. It covered him. He tore open his envirosuit and let it seep into every nook and cranny. It got into his eyes, his open mouth. "Yes! I want it! Give it to me, you dumb animal bitch! You bald fucking bastard! Yeah!" Then, quite quickly, the man saw it, and Fuller felt it. Intense heat under the surface of his skin. Muscles, all of them, twisting, cramping, nerves stinging, skin prickling, dark specks bursting through everywhere, erupting into coarse fibers. His insides were being turned outside. That new biomass had to come from somewhere. His thick hair grew out of every pore on his body. like a child pushing plasticine through a toy spaghetti maker, until there's nothing left to push. Digging through hair and scraps of desiccated skin, he eventually found the transponder for Fuller's personal shuttle. He had a long ride back to consider many things. First and foremost, he apologized to his family for keeping them in the dark, and promised to do better and be better from here on out. It took his wife some time to fully forgive him for being so reckless, but mostly she was just relieved that he was home safe, and relieved that he wouldn't be keeping his head shaved. She thought it made him look like a monk, or a mogul. No, as for the hair, he decided he would just ride it out, come what may. There was more dignity in it, the dignity of simply not giving a shit. Oh, sure, sometimes he would look in the mirror and long for those halcyon days. But then he'd think about what that meant to him, and with some people would have him think it meant. And he'd remind himself that those two things were not the same. He was healthy, and he was happy. And that was more than enough. If it wasn't for others, let them rub whatever they wanted on their heads. The bald bastards. Bald. It was pretty funny. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, Tonic, was written and performed by Anthony Botelho. Thank you to Egg Boy, Nikita Ross, Jean-Luc, Iona O'Keefe, Josh, David Milanowski, Mando Brando, and Basty for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botelho, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media, @The Wrong Station, and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next season, thank you for listening.